and then negotiation starts in July. Again, this is a very aggressive timeline. It is possible that some of these dates could get pushed through various factors if it takes us longer to get certain approvals than expected with NTIA. And so this is really kind of best case scenario. We're expecting kind of the first round of awards to be announced in August, and then obviously a second round to probably follow, with having it as a goal to be done by the end of December, assuming that we really have no later than probably February to turn in our final proposal to NTIA. So talking about volume 1 and volume 2 a little bit more in depth. Obviously, volume 1 discussed our challenge process, and we got a lot of really constructive feedback based on our plan, and everywhere we could, we tried to incorporate that feedback. We definitely feel like incorporating the public comments definitely made our volume 1 a stronger plan. With that, now we have moved on to volume 2, where we are definitely primarily talking about subgrantee selection, and public comment on that closes on December 1st. We encourage you to get your comments in soon. We did see a flood of comments right at the very end for volume 2. And what I would ask is, or for volume 1, and what I would ask is if you could submit those sooner rather than later, that would be very helpful to us, just because we are expecting to have quite a high volume for volume 2 of comments. And the more that we can go ahead and get comments more on a rolling basis, it gives us a little bit more time to review those and consider those, rather than everything right at the end, as we're, at that point making kind of final updates to the plan before we submit it. So just going through volume 2 in a little bit more depth. Obviously it's got, our goals and objectives of the program, talking about our existing efforts, talking about existing federal funding. Obviously that's something that we're aware of, all the previous federal funding programs, including State Fiscal Recovery Fund and Capital Projects Fund. But that is still where we are, currently actively working with applicants to get down to the location and fabric ID of those funded locations, so that those are not eligible for the program. And obviously that's going to be a large component as well of our state challenge process, to make sure that, beyond all of our efforts, to make sure that, the providers also feel that none of those locations are included for BEAD eligibility. Obviously, we've done a great deal of stakeholder engagement throughout this entire process, with a number of in-person listening sessions early this year. Obviously, we've been at all sorts of various meetings and conferences and annual meetings, summits, national conferences. But it was really important to us to make sure that we were on the ground, doing, over 30 listening sessions through this process to shape our 5-year action plan, our digital equity plan, and both of these volumes. Really understanding the state of broadband on the ground is really incredibly important to us to make sure we get this right. In addition to that, obviously we are clearly making sure we understand which locations are eligible and which ones aren't. And so based on our BSLs, and obviously working through the state challenge process through that, our community anchor institution list is obviously very robust, but it's generally kind of such an open-ended topic, and we've tried to approach it from a very broad perspective of what locations would be eligible and deemed a community anchor institution. So we would love your continued feedback if there are any locations that you feel that need to be still added to our list. That will also be something that we can work through in the state challenge process as well. Obviously, we have our challenge process where not only providers will be able to tell us about planned service to take those locations out of eligibility, but then also will, local governments, nonprofits, or other ISPs could also challenge if they feel like a provider is overstating their coverage. So it will really have those two components. And then obviously we have our subgrantee selection process of how we will award out our 1.3 billion, and how we will get service to all of our remaining unserved locations. And again, a vast majority, we believe, of our underserved locations, even with our pre-challenge modifications. And then looking at non-deployment processes, we truly don't believe that we're going to have any remaining funds. But if we do, obviously looking at what we can do to support digital connectivity, and some of the other eligible uses. But again, our plan does not really heavily focus on that because we don't believe that the funding is going to be available. And then with that, there are also direct implementations of activities that the state is going to undertake, really kind of more programmatic things of how we actually are going to be running the BEAD program. One of the things, obviously, it's a requirement from NTIA, just like we have seen previously in State Fiscal Recovery Fund and Capital Projects Fund, are, certain requirements around fair labor standards. Obviously, that's a scored component. We'll discuss scoring in just a moment. We are looking very much at workforce readiness. We're working with the technical college system here in Georgia to try to develop curriculum and stand up classes and hopefully some labs so that we can try to use those state resources to make sure that we're really making sure that where there are gaps in the workforce, that we are hopefully doing what we can to help with that. But any continued feedback about areas where you're seeing gaps would also be very helpful to us as well. In addition to that, obviously there's a requirement about minority and women-owned businesses, and so that's something that we've highlighted in our plan to make sure that there's an available list working through the Department of Administrative Services, so that obviously anywhere possible that those companies are included in the process as well. Again, we also discussed in the plan some of the barriers and in broadband deployment. Also, we feel what could be driving cost. So we discussed some kind of strategies that we're looking at to potentially find ways that we can lower costs as well. There is a very robust climate assessment in there based on plans that already had been developed from GMA. Obviously, the low cost plan about how the state is planning to ensure broadband service to low income individuals. That is something that we have used language that's similar to other states. We do feel that the language is going to have to be amended in order to get our plan approved. But that's where, through public comment and through the our various advisory boards, that we feel like we, really will benefit from collaborative discussions with y'all to ultimately see if there's a dollar amount that we can settle upon that ultimately is agreeable to all involved. Again, the state is planning to ask for all of our allocation instead of how it was initially written in the BEAD NOFO, where we could request up to 20% of our funding. Their guidance has since changed, encouraging states to go ahead and request all of our funding with a special award condition with a SAC on it. And so that's what we are planning to do. And so then ultimately, obviously, we are certainly going to make sure that we, just as we have in our previous programs with terms and conditions, ensure that awardees accomplish the projects that they claim to through their grants. And then we also detail how we viewed kind of the middle class affordability plan requirement included in volume 2. So with that, just kind of high level, again, we've got our grant program structure. We've got our scoring criteria. We've got the mandatory low cost service option, and then also our application requirements. And so one of the things that we have looked at that's included in volume 1 is obviously NTIA's preference, and also the state's preference for making sure that the money that we're investing, that this is historic one-time money, and we want to make sure that we're investing in infrastructure that is going to have staying power and that is going to make the longest impact on the communities that we're serving. So with NTIA's guidance within the NOFO, we are prioritizing fiber as they do as well. And so for round 1 of our applications, we will only be receiving application for fiber to the premises. And then we will be looking at in subsequent rounds, alternative technologies at that point, once we're able to see how far financially we really can go feasibly with fiber. And then at that point, looking to alternative solutions to get us to our 100%. The other thing is, as you'll see with our scoring, obviously cost is a large component to that. Ultimately, as NTIA also states in their NOFO, ultimately we are looking for the providers that have, the capability and competency to carry out these projects. But obviously we're also looking generally to see who can deploy a quality product and deploy a quality network at the lowest cost to the state for this fund, so that we can obviously make our funds go as far as we possibly can. So again, based on kind of our process, we'll obviously have our application period. We're going to have our scoring process. At that point, once we see the data from the subgrantee selection process, at that point, we'll set the extreme high cost thresholds. We feel like it's important to see actual real application data rather than just using modeling to set a dollar figure for that. So ultimately, we're going to use that data to set that. Then at that point, once we have got that set, we'll have a better understanding of how we are going to negotiate with applicants on, if we are still going to ask them if they're willing to try to either bring their costs down or how to serve some of those extreme high cost locations, or if we realize that it obviously makes more sense to move those applications to a round 2. At the end of that, obviously, we just wanted to highlight that all of these will be provisional awards. We will have everyone sign a set of provisional terms and conditions, just for the fact that ultimately we need to make sure that anybody that's going to be included in our final proposal is ultimately willing to move forward with the state and do the project. Ultimately we want to make sure that we don't include someone in our slate of awardees. We get approved for our final proposal and then the company backs out. And so at that point, companies will sign provisional terms and conditions. And then at that point, once NTIA approves our final proposal, then the awardees will be signing updated terms and conditions to show that those are approved projects. It is in the plan that we have decided to use county boundaries as our grant areas. This is something that we had a lot of conversations with many stakeholders about. Obviously, it's something that we did for the Capital Projects Fund that we felt was very successful. Again, getting a great deal of feedback. We ultimately decided that doing a county project area again made the most sense for this program. We've tried to add in additional flexibilities that will definitely help applicants if they don't want to serve the entire county area, whether that's through partnering with another provider or being able to flag those locations that are extreme high cost that could be impacting their application. Or ultimately, you can remove some locations, but as we state in the plan, we really want to disincentivize cherry picking. And at that point, at our discretion, we'll deem an application ineligible if we feel that too much of the project area has been removed. Another reason why we really ultimately looked at the county grant areas, because of those additional flexibilities, we felt like some of the concerns that we had heard about Capital Projects Fund were alleviated based on these additional flexibilities, along with some states are doing this obviously at a census block group level, census tract level, or even a census block level. And we have 291,000 census blocks in Georgia. We felt like, given the 9 months roughly that we actually have to run our grant process and deal with deduplication and everything like that, we just felt like ultimately it was not a feasible process. Versus this essentially accounts for the fact that we really won't have to have a deduplication process, just because everybody's applying for pretty much the same thing. And then at that point, we will, in our plan, we say that we reserve the right to drop down to a smaller geographic unit like a census tract or ultimately census block or block group, if we need to, when we look at the areas where nobody applied. If there's a reason that nobody applied for a particular area, and we can start at that point subdividing the county to incentivize applications, we will do that as well. Again, talking about our scoring, the total outlay of funds is obviously the largest scored component, with that being 50 points. The lowest price for 100 by 20 service commitment, essentially that you agree to serve that for the same price that you would for any of your metropolitan areas, is 15 points. Compliance with fair labor laws is 10 points. As NTIA is structured, the program, none of the points in the 25 points that the state controls in any of the categories can exceed any of these 3 categories. So that's why our next highest is obviously community and local government support. We feel like it's very important to have community and local government support for these projects to obviously facilitate the permitting process. Just, for so many reasons, it's really important that the community is aware of the project and supportive of the project, and is going to help facilitate getting the project done. Speed to deployment is obviously something we're looking at on a tiered basis. If a company's been operating in Georgia for 3 years, obviously there's 2 additional points. If a company's headquartered in Georgia, an additional point. Our future proofing impact is for any locations that the state will put out on an additional list that we'll make available at the time of the grant process, that includes any location that is not currently served at 100 by 20 with a wireline connection. We're doing this to ensure that there is the availability and capacity to make sure that all locations are served and that we're not leaving anyone behind. And then ultimately, on a tiered scale, also within the plan of trying to get as close to kind of universal service in that county, of trying to incentivize applicants to apply for as many locations within that county project area as possible. We also have, so that is for priority broadband projects that NTIA deems as the 100% fiber projects that we will be accepting for round 1. For round 2 and a potential round 3, if we need it, we're going to be looking at this scoring criteria for other last mile broadband projects, or as NTIA deems them non-priority. Is that, again, the same top 3 in the structure, same for speed to deployment. The only difference here is we have taken out the future proofing component, just because obviously we will be looking at wireless technologies or potentially satellite here for what we'd be funding. And this is also an NTIA requirement for non-priority projects to include speed of network and technical capabilities to make sure that ultimately the technology has the capability of reaching those locations. So with that, again, so 75% of the points are obviously, as dictated by NTIA. This is our outline of obviously how we plan to allocate the other 25. However, during the public comment period, if there are other suggestions, we're certainly happy to take those into consideration. Again, ultimately, this is kind of the design of how we best think that we can meet both NTIA's goals and requirements, and then it's a funding opportunity, but then also our priorities as well. And so again, for public comment, we'd love for you to think about if we've, proposed the appropriate scoring categories, understanding with the NTIA requirements versus the ones that the state has chosen to add. And obviously, if you feel like we've put the proper weighting in those categories. So, that's certainly something that we encourage you to either mention on this call today or obviously submit via public comment. And again, if you foresee any changes in that, we'd love for you to share those thoughts with us. The other thing is too, obviously related to the low income service offering, where again, we've already talked about this. So again, I think we're going to have additional conversations as a group about what you're seeing in other states that might be a reasonable compromise based on what we believe the NTIA will approve. And so we definitely know that we're going to have to make changes to our plan as it currently stands. So with that, kind of just talking about next steps, and then we'll be happy to open it for questions. So obviously volume 1 has been submitted. Once we receive your public comments and make any changes following that, we will submit volume 2. At that point, again, once we have an approved volume 1 and a submitted volume 2, we can open our state challenge process, which as of right now, assuming that all of our approvals come in as expected, will hopefully be in January. And then following that, following our state challenge process, and then ultimately approval of volume 2 by NTIA, then at that point we'll open the grant. In addition to that, obviously, all of the information for this is on GTA's website. Obviously, this is the link to our initial proposal volume 2, but just more generally, if you go to gta.ga.gov and click on broadband up at the top, it's got lots of great information. It's got our 5-year action plan. Again, it will have the our volume 1 as submitted to NTIA tomorrow. It obviously has volume 2, and we'll also have our state digital equity plan this afternoon as well. But so with that, I would love to go ahead and turn it over. If there are any questions, if you want to put those in the chat, we'd be happy to facilitate those. And again, just wanted to do a quick overview of obviously the highlights of volume 2, but really appreciate you being with us today, and would love any questions you may have right now, or otherwise please feel free to submit anything that you would like us to consider to update in our plan in the public comment period. So the first question that we received was, will volume 1 and volume 2 be released for review after changes are made? Yes, so we plan to do that. Most states are doing that as well, where you'll see it updated on our website tomorrow, as I just mentioned, where you'll see what we submitted for volume 1. We'll follow the trend that other states have done as well, where obviously you'll see initially what we put out for public comment. Then you'll be able to see what we submitted to NTIA. And then obviously once we have an approved version, we'll post a copy of the approved version, just because it is also very possible that we might have to make changes to both volume 1 and volume 2 to get them approved by NTIA. But so we definitely want to publicly share those with you so that you're aware of what we've submitted. And then ultimately we'll post the final approved version based on what we've been able to negotiate with NTIA. We received a question that says, related to grants, what sort of grants are expected? So these are all going to be last mile fiber to the premises applications and grants for round 1. And then following round 1, in round 2 and even a potential round 3, we're potentially looking at that point at hybrid fiber coax, licensed fixed wireless, and then later, obviously, unlicensed fixed wireless or satellite, based on making sure that we get coverage to 100% locations, but they all will be last mile grants. Let's see what else we've got.
There's a few in the chat, Jessica.
Sure. Yes, GTA will be releasing the scoring rubric. We are actively working on that right now. We expect that obviously based on public comment, we might be changing some aspects currently of the rubric. But so as I mentioned before about the ability to have subcategories within that, once we've determined that, we will share that as well. But a lot of that is that we wanted to actually formulate that based on the feedback we also received from public comment. We didn't want to completely build out our rubric, and then we ultimately change some of our weighting or priorities based on your feedback. Let's see. The next one is, if an area has been approved for funding under the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund for a provider, how does this work? If an area has an RDOF award, it based on NTIA's NOFO, it is ineligible for the BEAD program. And so in our deduplication process, that's something where we will be getting all of the data from the November version of the FCC map, and then we're going to do a deduplication process to remove any location that we've already funded through State Fiscal Recovery Fund or Capital Projects Fund where those have not been built yet. Same process will happen for RDOF, Reconnect, the NTIA BIP award. And so there's a full list of programs that we actually submitted as Appendix 5 with our initial proposal volume 1 that were all of the different funding programs that we would look at to make sure that we ran the deduplication process on, because obviously, what we are looking to get funding to the locations that don't already have funding commitments. And so if it already has an enforceable funding commitment, it's not going to be eligible for this program. And so that's also why even after our deduplication process, it is an available option to also challenge that location in our state challenge process to make sure that those locations are not considered because there is an enforceable funding commitment. Let's see. Will y'all have access to the webinar? Yes, we are recording the webinar and we will post it on GTA's website. The next question is, will high cost areas be on hold until round 1 fiber infrastructure is built out? So I think I understand the question. So once we run round 1 and see the data of which locations are ultimately going to be included in those grant agreements, then at that point we'll run round 2 and potentially round 3 to get funding commitments for those locations. But so all locations that will be part of this program will have associated funding commitments when we submit our final proposal to NTIA. And then once we receive approval of our final proposal, then the projects can actually begin. Let's see. The next question is, how will rural and underserved areas be affected when companies are now running fiber in some areas of the county? It would be that several municipalities are not being served completely. So again, what we're doing is using the data within the FCC map to find locations that are unserved and underserved. And so if companies are currently running fiber, obviously those locations won't be eligible. If they're currently running fiber based on an enforceable funding commitment, those locations will be removed. If they're running fiber or building out based on private commitments, that's also something in the state challenge process that they can give that data to the state to make sure that we understand which locations they're actively building to right now. And so at that point, those will not be included as well. But so the goal of this is to get service to the locations where they either don't currently have a funding commitment or providers are not currently actively building out to those locations on their own. Let's see.
There's another question in the question and answer.
Sure. So will there be a guaranteed amount of money reserved for funding round 2? 100% of fiber deployments will be the priority, considering South Georgia has a lot of more rural area. It may not be financially savvy to have 100% fiber deployment. However, these are critical areas. Without a dedicated amount being reserved for round 2, is it possible they might be left out again? So great question. So that's something that we are going to have to take a look at once we have the data back from round 1, understanding financially what we're really able to do. And so that's also something that that's going to really impact where we set our extreme high cost threshold to make sure that we have enough funding to make sure that we meet our requirement, which is getting to 100% of the unserved locations. So we have to make sure there's enough money available for round 2 because we have to get a funding commitment to our unserved locations. That's also why we reserve the right that if we feel that we need to for round 2 or any subsequent rounds, that we might at that point only ask for bids for the unserved locations and not the underserved locations in those potential areas if we feel like financially we need to make that adjustment as well. But ultimately, based on the data that we receive, funding will have to be available for round 2, because we have to find a way to get funding commitments at the very least to all of our unserved locations to be compliant with this program. And so that will very much factor into what dollar figure we set for our extreme high cost threshold, where we essentially draw the line in the sand and say, you know, beyond X dollars, we don't have enough funding to fund fiber beyond X dollars per passing. And so that is something that we are very aware of, that we will, you know, definitely analyze what we receive in round 1, to make sure that we have enough funding to make sure that we get to all of our unserved locations. Let's see, next question. EMCs have infrastructure limited to specific areas within counties in service territories. Is it mandatory for EMCs seeking the grant to collaborate with other entities to cover the remaining parts of the county? Will our application be disadvantaged if our focus is solely on serving membership within the defined geographic locations? So that's where we've tried to put multiple mechanisms into this program, where we've provided even additional flexibility from our capital projects fund. Obviously, you know, our preference is that you would find a partner to serve the remaining part of the county. However, that is where we do allow ultimately the flexibility where you can remove locations in the project area where that ultimately are, if they're either extreme high cost, or you can prove that they're very costly and impacting your application, or at that point, if you do remove those locations though, or just remove locations at that point though, based on the scoring preference of at least getting to 90% of that project area, you know, additional points will not be awarded. You know, I understand that there's, you know, lots of different, you know, entities in this that have traditional territories. Our goal is that we have to get 100% of locations in Georgia served. And so at that point, part of this goal is really trying to incentivize people to go further, because we have to find somebody that is willing to pick up these locations. With our previous grants, while they've been very successful and have been very good programs, we've always had to kind of take a bite out of the apple. But with this program, we have to figure out how to eat the entire apple in 9 months. And so, you know, we're trying to put in additional flexibilities from our previous programs. Partnerships are one of them, which obviously we did that last time. But we are obviously allowing for removing some locations or flagging for high cost. But the goal of this program is that our goal as a state, and the goal of the entire BEAD program, is to incentivize people to go where they have not gone before. And so at that point, you know, we have to find somebody that is willing to go to the other side of that county, or the other side that might not be your territory. And so that's where we hope that, you know, you would find a partner to serve the vast majority of that project area. But again, there is the flexibility that there was not in capital projects fund, where you could decide to only serve a portion of a county that is below, obviously the scoring criteria that would get you more points. However, you know, you do run the risk that if somebody else does come in and apply to serve the entire county, that ultimately that is preferable to the state, because ultimately our requirement here is we have to figure out how to get a funding commitment to 100% of our unserved locations. Let's see. Our unserved area is truly a priority in round 1 funding as the program is currently structured. So that is actually something that we are looking at potentially changing in our scoring. We do believe that it's very important to put the unserved and underserved locations out for bid at the same time, just because many of those locations through the various builds will be passed together based on seeing how a lot of the routes are mapped. But so we are looking at potentially amending our scoring so that we are trying to incentivize applicants to go specifically after the unserved locations. However, it is possible in some counties that the remaining unserved locations could be extreme high cost. Especially seeing based on some of our capital projects fund counties, it is possible that a number of those unserved locations at that point could could be those locations that go beyond that threshold. But we are trying to look at different strategies to make sure that to make sure we get to our unserved, just because obviously the underserved locations in general are going to be more attractive to build to. So that is something that we are considering.
Jessica, there is a hand raised. LL Kelly has his or her hand raised. The way of turning off
Their
the
way to take
mute.
her off of mute.
Julie, do you know a way of turning off the mute so that
They've got permissions. Everyone
okay.
should be able to speak.
Okay, she said she's good. Let's see.
Okay.
Will there be a required minimum applicant match for round 1 and round 2 if applicable? So yes, so there is obviously the 25% requirement match in the program. Obviously there is the process of requesting a waiver, or if something flags as high cost, to potentially remove that. But especially for round 1, there will be the 25% match requirement. And then at that point, we will look at the data to see, obviously, once we look at high cost, to what level we might be able to waive that matching requirement for those locations. Or at that point, make the determination if we push those to a secondary round for an alternative technology. And also that is also something I wanted to add of, for round 2, that is something at least where, as we're looking at alternative technologies, though, we would like to see a match as well. Just because it's flagged as extreme high cost for fiber, we would still like to see if we can get to that matching requirement if we're looking at an alternative technology. And then at that point, if that is not feasible, then we'll also look at that as well. But certainly the goal for round 1, for our fiber to the premises applications, is that there is the 25% match requirement that was designed by NTIA and the NOFO. That's all of the questions that I'm seeing. Does anybody else have any other questions, or if anybody would like to unmute, certainly happy to answer anything else as well. Again, we'll give everybody just another moment. If there are any other questions, either if you'd like to drop them into the Q&A or the chat, we'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, give you a couple minutes back. We will be posting this webinar on GTA's website at gta.ga.gov. Again, we really encourage you to please read the plan. I'm sorry it's so lengthy, but we tried to be thorough. Please give us your feedback. We're certainly open to considering it, but ultimately what we've tried to do is to try to put together the plan that we feel like meets all of our requirements and NTIA's requirements in the amount of time that we've been given to do it. But certainly would love your feedback. Again, it was a very productive process through volume 1. We did incorporate a lot of the feedback that was received, and we're expecting to receive a lot of feedback for volume 2. And again, we also encourage everybody to please look out for our digital connectivity plan, which will be going live this afternoon on GTA's website. And we would love your feedback on that as well. We have some upcoming events for that as well. And so really appreciate the participation and the collaboration on this program. This is a huge program, and it's really going to take all of us working together to make sure that we accomplish all of the goals that we've set forward in the plan. But with that, I really appreciate you joining us today. It doesn't look like we've received any other questions. Actually, it looks like we just got a couple others. So for the low cost plan, how long are those plans and pricing committed to? So the way that we currently put it in the in volume 2, that would be 8 years. However, we do expect that there are probably going to be significant changes, excuse me, to this section. Just based on what we're seeing of states using similar language and what NTIA is willing to approve and what they're really kind of pushing states towards. And so I do think that I'm sure we're going to receive a good bit of public comment on this section. And I think we're all going to have to collaboratively work together to ultimately come up with amended language that is agreeable to everyone involved, but that ultimately that we can get approved by NTIA. So the plan as it currently is written, I believe states 8 years, but there probably will be significant changes to this particular section. Anyway, with that, it looks like that was our last question. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. It looks like we just got one other question. What assurances or technical specifications are in place to make sure fixed wireless and satellite options provide high-speed internet access? Excuse me. So that's why for the other priority broadband projects, we've awarded 8 points in that particular section to go through the technical scoring and capacity, so that we can assess that and assign points based on ensuring the coverage of the network, the technical capability, looking at the network design. At that point, we're going to be at that point when we're looking at those particular applications, just because obviously with network design and understanding capacity, we probably will be bringing in our third-party consultants who are engineers to actually assess those applications. And that's why we've set aside 8 scoring points for that, to ensure that we feel like those funded networks meet those requirements. But that is something that we are taking into account. Well, with that, if we've got any other questions, I'll look for those really quickly in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and please feel free to reach out to any of us individually. You can always reach out to any of us at broadband@gta.ga.gov. And then we look forward to your comments and look forward to working together on this program. But thank you so much for joining us today. And please continuously check our website. We're going to always push things out on our email list as well, to make sure that everyone's aware as we have more documents available. But thanks for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of the afternoon. Thank you.